He promised to visit every Sunday, until his wife found out who I really was. For months we had a ritual: his shoes by the door, my kettle beginning to sing at 3, and the crossword spread between us on the kitchen table. We shared tea, a laugh, and small news about the lane. It was simple, it was soft. One Sunday he did not come. I waited. The chair across from me held its shape like a promise. The teacup cooled on the saucer. I set it down and listened to the porch light hum. Then a neighbor stopped by with a look that carried questions and the small, polite cruelty of gossip. Names got whispered. A photograph was shown. A sentence was said aloud, and suddenly the routine had a different meaning in other mouths. What had been a gentle friendship felt, in an instant, like a story rewritten without my say. My heart tightened the way a fist does when it remembers a habit. The chair across from me stayed empty the following Sunday, and the teacup grew cold on the saucer. I wondered then what else was changing in the small life we'd shared together. Hello, dear ones. Today we're talking about promises, whispers, and how a single discovery can change a neighborly pattern. Sit close. I want to tell you a quiet story about friendship, dignity, and how small courtesies can be misunderstood. If you like these kitchen table stories, please subscribe and leave a comment. Your words help others feel less alone. I promise to be honest and plain. I'll tell you what happened, how it felt the first Sunday the chair stayed empty, and the steps I took to keep my name and my peace. There will be hard moments and small comforts. There will be practical things you can use, short scripts for a hard conversation, ideas for setting gentle boundaries, and ways to hold civility without shrinking. Stay with me. I'll tell you why those Sunday visits mattered. One secret changed everything. The kettle sighs, the way it always does at this hour, a soft, approving sound that says, the house is awake. I put my thumb on the rim of the teacup, the way my mother taught me, and I wait for the steam to lift like a small benediction. Outside, the maples hold their leaves in a sun that has learned not to blaze too quickly. Inside, the radio whispers the morning news in a voice that has become part of the wallpaper. The chair by the window is my anchor. It is a plain chair with a cushion that has taken the shape of a body over 30 years. On Sundays, it used to hold another shape: a man who arrived with shoes scratched from the lane, a laugh that filled the porch, and a hand that cracked walnuts in the shell. Like it was the most important job in the world. We had a ritual. At 3 he came for tea. He liked his Earl Grey with 1 sugar and a slow stirring. We set the crossword sideways between us and argued gently about a clue. I would tell him about the tomatoes. He would complain about the neighbor's mower. There is something small and enormous about a repeated hour. It tells the world who you are, and it tells the world who belongs to you in a way that words do not. The sugar spoon always trembled a little in my hand. I used that tremor to measure time, to measure how much of life remains soft and how much has already hardened. On a good Sunday, the porch light hummed as if it were listening to APH, approving the shared quiet. The house keeps records of habit: a dent in the cushion marks where shoulders settled, a faint ring on the saucer marks where a cup cooled. The garden bench still remembers a shoe left behind once in a torrential storm. These are the small archives of our days. People who don't live with a repeated hour can't always imagine how necessary it is. Ritual is not just comfort, it is also dignity. When someone keeps his promise to come, he tells you that your time is worthy of being kept. That Sunday, the kettle sang, and the chair held its shape, but the other shape did not arrive. At 2:20 I felt the usual small lift, the pleasant way anticipation's not in your chest. At 2:45 I set the teapot and checked the garden gate. At 3 the porch was quiet. I set the cup on the saucer and let the steam go, as if the act itself could honor a habit even when the human actor was gone. I did not know whether to be hurt or practical. I rehearsed the ordinary explanations: traffic, a grocery emergency, an errand that took longer than expected. Someone forgets now and then. If it were a single Sunday, it would have been just that. Neighbors noticed the small change before words named it. Mrs. Hale from next door walked past and paused on the path, her face the map of curiosity and concern. "He's been busy," she offered, as a neighbor does when she wants to help you keep the story gentle. I nodded and kept the kettle warm. But when the second Sunday came and the chair was empty again, the pattern stopped being an accident and started to feel like a decision. The teacup cooled on the saucer as if it were a small clock marking the time since a promise was kept. I began to see in the front window the way the lane would fold itself into routine, and how a missing step could make the whole row of houses look as if someone had shifted their posture. I found myself looking for explanations in tiny places: a newspaper left folded in the wrong corner, a shoe tracked onto the mat that did not belong to him, a postcard tucked behind the radio. These are small things that people miss until the pattern matters. I kept my hands busy, straightening the napkins, tucking a stray thread into the cushion because movement quiets the restlessness. And then, on the third Sunday, Mrs. Hale came with a look that was not quite casual. She brought a tea loaf and set it on my table, but her eyes were on the cup that had gone cold 2 weeks in a row. She did not come to gossip. She came with the weight of a neighbor who had seen something that needed naming. On the table, beside the sugar bowl, I found a folded note with no signature. I can still hear my mother's voice. When dusk settled and she turned the kettle off for the second time, "Leave the light on for latecomers," she would say. And the instruction felt like a prayer for strangers and friends alike. Our house was the kind of home where the door might open for someone who'd forgotten their keys. There was always an extra plate in the larder. My father taught us numbers and promises the same way. He kept a ledger of chores and paid respect with his small, steady motions. He would say, "A man's word is his receipt." That phrase lodged in me like a seed. We planted our lives on those small assurances. When I was courting, promises were not dramatic vows whispered under the eaves. They were small agreements about who would be where on Sunday morning, who would fix the fence, and whether you would be home to answer the telephone. My husband was a practical man. He measured love with handiwork and with attention. We married with a quiet ceremony and built a life of small investments: a roof that mended a leak, tomatoes that needed thin slicing, children to teach how to fold socks. We learned early that trust is a thing you tend like a garden, not flashy, but necessary. I taught our son to shake hands firmly, to call if he couldn't make a promise, to set an extra place even if no one was coming because you might have company after all. Hospitality was a duty, and duty was a kind of devotion. My mother told stories about neighbors who arrived with an urgent need and how the family's simple acts, a meal, a night's shelter, a listening ear, had kept the neighborhood stitched together. That stitched together life shaped me. I learned to read the small texts of days, the way a person's shoes were worn, the way a gate squeaked when it was opened too often, the way a chair lost its plumpness in the middle from being chosen most. These things meant something. They are the grammar of a community. So when a man across the lane told me he would come every Sunday, I received it as an extension of those values. Another small agreement entered into with intention. We were not making covenants in the way you see in movies. We were making appointments with our time, simple, ordinary promises that life respects. A promise to come is also a promise to care, to witness, to listen, to be present in the small ways that add up to a life. That is why the empty chair felt like a question, and not just an absence. There are lessons that come from weather and work and small kindnesses. When my husband died, I kept his watch on the dresser for a long time, as if its ticking could keep the pattern of his presence. Time taught me a different truth. Love is not only about keeping someone, but about making sure the ways you keep are worthy. I have always believed that the measure of a neighbor is not how loudly he proclaims loyalty, but how steadily he shows up when it is ordinary to do so. That is why a promise like "See You Sunday" carried the weight it did. Yet there is another lesson, one that comes with age. People are more complicated than the roles we give them. Promises can be kept and misread. Courtesy can be mistaken for something else. The steady rhythm of visits can be interpreted in 100 different ways by 100 different onlookers, and sometimes the meaning drifts away from what was intended. I taught my son to keep his word because I wanted him to be a man of his name. And still I learned, with a small, surprised grief, that even vows taught carefully can fray. I sat at my window remembering all of this and thinking of small hands, my boy's hands when he was small, and I understood that the wound was not merely that the visits had stopped. It was that a quiet life had been reframed by other people's stories. I had always tried to protect the dignity of those who came to my table. Now I needed to protect my own. I taught my son to keep his word, and yet one Sunday the world taught me how quickly promises can fray. We built our life out of small, steady things: a mortgage paid on time, school concerts attended, a roof patched in a slow spring rain, little acts of help folded into being. I would bring a pot of soup when someone's heater failed. A neighbor would water our hydrangeas when we went away. These favors were the mortar of community. They formed a rhythm that made the lanes safe for children and polite for adults. Over the years, habits set like a gentle pattern, until intentions hardened into assumptions. Assumptions are a quiet fault line. When you let someone take over a task to be helpful, the helping can become the doing. At first it felt like relief. Someone else collected the mail when we were sick. Someone shuffled the chairs for the neighborhood picnic. Then, as kindness aggregated, roles shifted without an announcement. The person who once arrived with a board and a hammer learned where the toolbox was kept. The neighbor who came to check the fuse began to clear the leaves from the gutters. You are grateful at first, because community is neighborly. But there comes a day when you notice it is easier for others to decide how your house should be organized than for you to say what you prefer. My husband and I made compromises, as every couplet does, and we taught our son how to accommodate. Sacrifices are small, but they stack up, one on top of another. A favorite armchair was moved to make space for a new exercise machine. Keys were left on a different hook for the convenience of someone who visited. I never minded giving up a thing that made someone else's day easier, not until the day when the small conveniences meant my own voice had subtly been lowered in the room. Those changes were not malicious. They were often an offering. But there is a place where generosity meets neglect. When the lane came to mean something different to different people, the same kindness could be narrated as care by some and as control by others. The neighbor who promised Sundays may have meant friendship. His wife, seeing things through a different lens, may have read something else, a history, a rumor, a private past. The house, in its quiet way, keeps records of these shifts. You can trace them in hooks left empty, in teacups that do not get washed, in calendars that show an absence. I learned to notice the small mismatches. A birthday crossed out with pencil instead of pen, a donated jar of my preserves found at a garage sale, a name written on a list that had been my husband's. Those were fine as accidents, but in aggregate they made me alert. I started to keep little notes for myself, a small ledger of requests and appointments. It isn't an accusation to take note. It is a way to keep your own story in the room. When the neighbor's visits stopped, the fault line did not appear as a crack but as a silence. The lanes seemed to lean away, and conversations thinned. People began to choose their words carefully when they passed by. The question was not just whether he would return, it was whether the pattern of small decisions would tilt the neighborhood toward judgment rather than understanding. That week, a neighbor's passing comment at the post office landed like a pebble and made ripples. One afternoon, a photo was shown, and a name was said aloud, and what followed was a hush I could not unhear. It began, as small-town dramas often do, with a harmless glance. I was hanging laundry at the back line when Mrs. Weller from down the lane came by with a casserole and an apology all wrapped together. She lingered longer than usual, peering at a stack of photographs on my mantel. "Oh look, is that you?" she asked, pointing to a black and white shot of a summer picnic. Two young people laughing with their arms slung around one another. I smiled and told her the year 1963, and the names, the old sort of names that felt like family heirlooms. Then, later that day, I heard that photo had been shown to someone else. It landed in a different ear. A neighbor, well-meaning and sharp-tongued, passed it on. That neighbor's wife, the one who used to smile and then go home and speak in a clipped way about boundaries, saw the picture. A name she did not expect was attached. A small misremembered story became, in her telling, something that required correction. He had promised to come every Sunday. We had built a small pattern of visits. Tea at 3, a crossword, the soft rhythm of a voice that knew how to laugh at the same jokes. I never thought to guard that routine. It was a kindness, and kindness usually keeps its own silence. But the photograph stirred up a different kind of silence, the one that says, "There are things better left unsaid." The neighbor's wife felt uneasy. She asked questions that sounded reasonable to her. Who was that person? When did you know him? Why were you alone with him on that holiday 20 years ago? When the neighbor heard the worry in his wife's voice, he stepped back. He explained to her in the privacy of his kitchen. He told her, privately, that our visits were nothing but friendly, that we had been neighbors for decades, but domestic conversations have their own gravity. The story shifted from a private pattern into a public question. People like tidy narratives. They prefer a simple answer to the meanders of long lives. Before I knew it, the pattern of Sundays was reframed in other voices as something borderline scandalous. The man who had promised to come was careful with his feet. He began to duck down the street earlier, leaving my garden empty. I felt the small humiliation like a bruise. It was not the loss of his presence alone. It was the realization that a life you have lived honestly can be made to look different by someone else's fear. I wondered why a photograph could hold so much power. I wondered how one glance could rearrange the terms of companionship. I went to the window and watched the lane, as if by watching I could rewind the moment. But time does not rewind. It only asks you to answer. I called him once, only to hear the phone click and a voice that asked for space. "I'm sorry, Evelyn," he said. "Things are complicated at home." That phrase sounded like a closing door more than an apology. I said nothing more than, "All right, take care." I put the receiver down and listened to the kettle sigh the way it always does. The house was the same. The sound that used to mean comfort felt like a marker now. He promised me he would come Sunday. Then he did not come at all. Gossip in small towns isn't shouted, it's handed like a dish. Softly and with expectation. The hush that followed the missing visits turned into a murmur. It crept through the lane, in small courtesies and careful questions. People who had always waved from their porches now offered brief nods and then looked away, as if they were afraid to keep staring. I felt the change the way you feel a draft, not immediately, but persistently. I tried to stitch things back together with normalness. I set the kettle to sing on schedule, folded the napkins as I always had, and placed 2 teacups on the table, one for me and one for the empty cushion, as if ceremony could call someone back. I asked the neighbor, gently, "Is everything all right?" I said. He hemmed and hawed, the way men do when they are balancing loyalty and caution. "Oh, Evelyn, you know how it is at home," he said. I didn't want to make things awkward. That will to avoid conflict is an unkind kindness. It moves away from the person who is being observed and toward the person who is concerned about appearance. I could see he was torn. He valued our visits, but he also wanted peace in his house. I understood both things, and that only made the small pain more complicated. Word travels in half the phrases. A neighbor mentioned old histories at the post office counter. A woman I had known from church clasped my hand and said, "You mustn't worry, dear," with the tone of someone who both wants to console and to close the subject. It felt like the world was labeling me without asking. Children who used to stop on their way home to say hello were now told not to linger. That hurt in a different place than my pride. It touched the small, quiet place in a grandmother's heart that wants the street to be open and welcoming to little legs and small questions. I felt my own family tighten around me in practical ways. My daughter visited more often, bringing casseroles and a careful look. "Maybe we should keep things low-key for a while," she suggested, and I heard the caution in her voice. My son, more practical, said, "Maybe you should stop having him over." Both pieces of advice came from love, but they pulled in different directions, one toward preserving reputation, the other toward preserving the ritual I valued. When the Sunday group from church met, I declined the invitation. I did not yet have the words, but one woman from that circle, who had always been frank in a soft way, sidled over to my fence. She asked me, sideways, if there was more to the story than I'd told. Her question was not cruel. It was a mirror held up. I could see my life, reflected back to me in a way that did not match my own memory of it. I didn't want to start a fuss. I didn't want to be the cause of more discomfort for anyone, but I also did not want to be rewritten by whispers. The hardest part was the small indignities that come when people begin to imagine the worst. Invitations stopped arriving, not bluntly, but by omission. A neighbor who used to bring over a jar of preserves would now cross to the other side of the drive. It is surprising how quickly community courtesies can change their tone when suspicion colors them. A woman from the Sunday group asked me, sideways, if there was more to the story than I'd told. An empty chair is easy to ignore. It is harder when people start to imagine why it's empty. Practicalities began to shift, like weather. Invitations that had once come with regularity grew thin and cautious. The garden club postponed a get-together I had hosted for years. Our picnic bench, which used to host neighbors' plates and laughter, sat polished and alone. When community support becomes conditional, you notice in small ways, dishes that didn't get returned, offers of help that turned into instructions, calls that began with, "We were asked to be careful." It is one thing for gossip to shape opinions. It is another when your own family begins to measure what others might say. My daughter urged discretion. "Maybe lay low for a bit," she said as she folded towels. "People talk, Mom. It's easier if you're not where they can say things." Her words were a shield and also a hand that would rearrange my days. My son, practical and protective, suggested a different route. Go speak to the neighbor's wife herself, find out what she thinks, and clear the air. Both suggestions wanted the same end, peace, but they sketched different means. When the neighbor's wife sent a forwarded message to my daughter's phone, it changed the tone of the room. It was not an accusation so much as a request for caution. Please don't let things seem odd, it said. My daughter showed it to me with that look you get when you are delivering news you hope will be trivial. It wasn't trivial. The words landed as if someone had opened a curtain and shown the backstage to people who preferred the performance to continue. Conversations at family dinners shifted. Someone would mention that appearances matter because a small town is where reputations travel faster than the post. Others reminded me gently of privacy and boundaries. I listened because I am a mother and a grandmother, and because I love our little neighborhood. But I also felt a pressure to choose between my own experience of a quiet, loyal friendship and the narrative that others were knitting from fragments. When invitations are rescinded, it is not always dramatic. Often it is a polite omission. People stop suggesting you bring a dish. They forget to pass an invitation. It is the slow pruning of presence. The church group began to ask questions in smaller rooms, as if dissent had to be contained. The neighbor's wife began to attend more community events with her husband by her side. They made an elegant kind of separation, not a confrontation, but a social rearrangement that left me in a quieter orbit. I thought of all the times I had washed a neighbor's dish or swept a stoop. I thought of the way kindness had always been returned with kindness in the lane. Now, suddenly, the lane felt like a set of careful calculations. I wanted to ask anyone who would listen, must friendship always answer for someone else's fear? But the question itself risked more gossip. Decisions were expected of me and of them, and the choices were not easy. A forwarded message from the neighbor's wife arrived on my daughter's phone, and it changed the room's tone. Sometimes the past arrives in a postcard and everyone reads it the wrong way. After the message, I began to look in small, deliberate places for clarity. Old drawers hold more than linens. They hold the quiet history of a life. I opened the top drawer of the sideboard, the one where I keep the odds and ends, extra keys, an old fountain pen, a stack of postcards from summers long gone. My hands paused on a faded envelope with a return address I had not seen in decades. The handwriting was familiar in a way that made my chest tighten. It was from someone who had once mattered in a different chapter of my life. It is a strange thing to encounter memory on paper. A name can feel like a map that leads you back to an intersection you thought you had long passed. That envelope held a letter I had tucked away and not tossed. The kind of saving we do because the world made sense once, and you feared losing its edges. Reading it again, I remembered a time when mistakes were forgiven, and people moved on. I remembered the friend who was once at the center of a story that had no room for nuance once it reached unfamiliar ears. I did not want to hide the letter. I also did not want it to be used as a weapon. Secrets have a way of reanimating in ways that hurt people who had nothing to do with the original moment. I thought of the neighbor's wife, of the look that had shifted in her eyes when she was shown a photograph. I thought of the neighbor himself, who had been a steady presence for years. I began to understand how an old story could be dragged into the light and chewed over until its edges were sharp. My family pressed gently. "Do you want us to talk to them?" my son asked. He wanted to protect me, but his idea of protection was to keep me from being in the position of explanation. My daughter wanted me to hold my dignity by telling my truth openly. I felt the tug between pride and prudence. There are some stories you can correct plainly, others require patience. I went to the neighbor's house one evening with the letter folded in my pocket. I did not intend to wave it like a flag. I only wanted to say what was true, that our visits had meant companionship, not secrets, and that a photograph cannot hold the whole heart of a friendship. He opened the door with the same hands that had once carried a sack of flour for me when my cupboard was low. He looked at me with a face that held both apology and fear. "Evelyn," he said softly, "it's complicated." The word complicated is the softest way a life can say, "I am entangled." I listened to him tell of a misunderstanding with his wife, of a family story he had tried to protect, of a past that reared up unexpectedly. He did not make excuses. He described fear. I could see that the thing that had wounded me had also frightened him. Still, being frightened does not erase hurt. I found an old envelope in the drawer with a name I hadn't seen in 20 years. People want answers quickly. They prefer neat stories even when life is messy. Rumors find fertile ground when there is a deadline. In a small town, events arrive on the calendar and pressure gathers behind them like weather. The annual civic luncheon was 3 days away. The church raffle would be held on Saturday. The neighborhood association expected a courtesy speech. Someone raised a hand, not unkindly, and suggested that the matter of the neighbor be addressed at the meeting. "We don't want the event to be awkward," someone said. "It is a reasonable thing to say when you organize a room full of people who prefer tidy evenings and polite small talk." But it felt like being asked to be an exhibit. My children looked at me in a way that said, "We need to act." Their concern was not about gossip for gossip's sake. They feared reputational damage the way you fear a storm that will bend a garden. My son called the neighbor and asked him if he would speak privately before the luncheon. The neighbor said he would try. The neighbor's wife requested a conversation at the church office with the pastor. In attendance, a request that carried an air of finality. They wanted a resolution before the public gathering. I felt the pressure like a hand on my shoulder. I had choices stacked up like plates: say nothing and risk whispers, speak and risk escalating, or withdraw from the events and lose the small joys of community life. The thought of canceling my own attendance at the luncheon made my chest ache. I had organized that table for years. The idea of absenting myself from something I loved because others wanted a cleaner narrative felt unfair. Yet I also understood the practicalities. An unresolved question can cloud an event and cause more pain than a private clarity might. That week, neighbors began to ask questions in polite tones. The pastor called to say that, for the sake of the congregation, they wanted to avoid surprise. A member of the association suggested we handle this privately, the softest way a committee can say, "We will decide without letting everyone see." I felt the small, humiliating itch of being discussed in rooms where I was not present. At home, I made a note of the facts as I remembered them, date by date. Small details that could not be misunderstood. I wrote down who came on which Sunday, what we spoke about, and when a photograph had been taken. It was both a comfort and a weapon, a way to hold my memory in the same hand I used to make tea. I asked my daughter to be at my side if a conversation happened. She looked squeezed between protecting me and making sure the town did not swallow my story for lack of clarity. The request came, and it felt like the day was a cup turned from me. They asked me to speak at the annual meeting, and meant it for the next week. After the request that I speak at the meeting, someone I trusted came by with a small parcel and a look that said, "I've been meaning to tell you." It was Mrs. Calder, who lives 2 doors down and has been a friend for 40 years. She sat in my kitchen, the way neighbors do when they must offer difficult news, hands folded, voice low. "There's more to it than the picture, Evie," she began. "I thought you should know what I heard." She told me, plainly, about a story that had been circulating, not in malice, but in fear. 20 years ago, the neighbor's family had a trouble, a rumor, a relationship misread. People had made assumptions. The wife, who had been raised tightly and taught to guard a husband's steadiness, had heard the photograph explained in a way that set off an alarm in her. She believed, for reasons I could see and feel in her face, that something secret was being repeated. Mrs. Calder brought a box of letters from the church archives. She had found an old note, misfiled, that referenced a brief time when friendships blurred and when a wrong assumption had been offered as truth. The note was not evidence of wrongdoing. It was evidence of gossip. It was evidence of how stories travel and change shape the more they're told. Hearing that changed things. My first feeling was relief. Relief that I had not done anything callous. But relief turned quickly into the harder work of understanding. The revelation softened the edge of my anger because I could now see the source of the fear. It did not, however, erase the sting of having been reframed by other people's fear. Compassion complicated the matter. I felt for the woman whose life had been unsettled in the past, and I felt for my neighbor, who was torn between honesty and protecting his household. The middleness of this knowledge was its burden. If the wife's reaction came from a real hurt long ago, then the solution could not simply be to demand she stop asking questions. I had to listen. I had to find a way to hold my own truth while acknowledging her wound. That balance is a fragile thing. It feels at once like mercy and like setting a boundary. So I did what I have always done when the public and the private press against each other. I wrote down what I would say. I wrote how I would speak plainly without humiliating anyone. I asked Mrs. Calder to come to the meeting, as one who could vouch for what she had found. I asked the neighbor to invite his wife. I asked for a friend from church to be present so the tone could remain kind and not combative. Understanding what had caused the alarm, did not make forgiveness automatic. It made the next step harder, because now it was clear that if I wanted to keep the good of the street and the dignity of the people involved, I would have to speak in a way that healed rather than wounded. The question was how to be honest and gentle at once. I drew up a small plan, nothing dramatic, just plain steps. Step 1. A private conversation with the neighbor and his wife. Step 2. If the private words did not settle the matter, a short public clarification at the next church gathering, brief, factual, and offered in good faith. Step 3. Boundaries going forward. A promise of visits only when invited, a simple calendar on the fridge, and an agreement that nothing between adults would be talked about in ways that turned private kindness into public question. I asked the pastor to be present for the clarification, if it came to that. He said yes, in the generous way pastors do. I asked Mrs. Calder to come and say what she had found in the box of letters. I asked my friend June to sit with me as a witness, someone who knew the story and could keep the tone steady. She agreed and squeezed my hand, the way friends do when they know you will set your voice. The cost was immediate. When I mentioned the plan to neighbors, some tilted their heads and said, "Oh, you don't have to make a fuss." The phrase sounded meant to smooth things over by asking me to be small. Others came with casseroles and said, "Thank you for standing up for yourself." People prefer neat endings. They either tell you to hush or to hold your ground loudly. There is little room for measured steps. Inside my house, my son and daughter watched warily. "You don't have to make this a public matter," my son advised gently. "It will only stir things." My daughter, who keeps a different kind of courage, told me she'd stand by whatever I chose to do. I felt the familiar ache of a mother who must choose between being comforted and being true. The plan, I knew, would be read as stubbornness by some, and as leadership by others. I accepted that. I rehearsed what I would say. "We have been neighbors for decades. The visits were a kindness. If my friendship has caused fear, I regret that hurt. But kindness is not something to be framed as impropriety. Let us speak plainly so we can close the door on rumor." It is an awkward sentence. It asks for both apology and respect, which sometimes sound at odds. I thought of my husband's voice advising steadiness. He would have said, "Say what you must, and then let it rest." The cost of the plan was not only social, it was the private labor of repeating truth until it is heard. It was the willingness to be misunderstood for a while. That night, some called me stubborn. I called it wanting to be seen. The week before the meeting felt like a weather front rolling in. Conversations at the post office lengthened. The church secretary called to ask if my statement would be brief. The neighborhood association texted about seating at the luncheon. I could feel a tension like humidity, present and thick. People meant well. Some meant curiosity. The result was the same. A different pressure in the air. Meals arrived at my door. "Just in case," said Mrs. Hale, who left a bowl of stew and a note that read, "We'll stand with you." That steadiness was a balm. Others offered advice in the form of caution. "Don't make it a scandal." I understood their fear. Scandal corrodes quietly, but avoiding the subject would not change the way it had already been told. Family conversations got sharper. My son was worried about how the story might affect his business relationships. "It's not just you, Mom," he said. "People will assume." My daughter, who has a firmer sense of truth and diplomacy, said, "If something is wrong, better to fix it now than let it fester." Their emotions sat across the tea table like two different maps to the same place. The neighbor came to the house and sat in my kitchen like a man who had been caught between two loyalties. "I should have told her sooner," he said. "I didn't want to make trouble." I could hear how regret sat in his words, a small, heavy thing. He wanted to keep his marriage steady and our friendships simple. He loved both in his bottom drawers and had not known how to take them both out at once. Rumors decide quickly what they want to be. The town chose its stories in whispers that felt like small pins on a map. Some folks sided with me, others with the neighbor's wife. A few tried to keep out of it and succeeded only at making the air colder. The pastor suggested we make the church meeting an exercise in listening rather than in accusation. He wanted people to hear each other and not to sharpen their tongues. That felt right, and also luckier than I expected. The mediator, a calm woman from the diocesan office, agreed to sit near the front and keep the tone moderated. I practiced what I would say. I breathed in the small ritual of lighting a candle before I spoke. The gesture steadied me. It reminded me that, for all the gossip and the fear, The place where we would speak belonged to all of us. Tomorrow the church hall would fill, and a microphone would wait for me. That night the house felt too big. The chair where he used to sit kept its shape in the dark. I made tea, though I could not sleep. The kettle's whisper was louder in the quiet. Each small sound in the house took on the weight of a question. The clock ticked like a voice asking, "Are you sure? Are you ready?" I turned to my memory for counsel. My husband's voice came back to me with the same practical tenderness he always had. "Stand where you are," he would have said. "Be steady. Truth is patient." Those words steadied me for a while, but then doubt came like a tide. If I spoke, would it ripen into more talk than necessary? If I stayed silent, would my life be rearranged by rumor? I thought of all the small kindnesses that had made the lane into a place where children left their bikes against fences and doors remained unlocked. I thought of the times I had forgiven, and of the times I had asked for the same grace for myself. There is a difference between humility and erasure. I refused to be erased. With the house quiet and the lamp against the kitchen wall, I took out paper and a pen. I wrote a short note to myself, what I would say, in plain sentences. I wrote the facts I knew. I wrote about the photograph and the years of visits. I wrote that the visits were friendship and that if they had caused fear, I regretted the hurt. I wrote that kindness has many shapes and that mine had never intended harm. Folding the paper felt like folding a flag. I put it in my pocket as if carrying a small compass. The decision to speak was not theatrical. It was economy, the smallest number of words that could remake the story without weaponizing anyone's shame. I practiced the sentences aloud in the dark. I have been your neighbor for decades. I have kept my hands open. I will not let rumor steal the small kindness we have kept. I almost folded the note back into its envelope and decided to say nothing. It would have been easier. Nobody would have been upset. I would have kept my evenings the same and let the lane live in its polite silence. But I could already imagine the slow gnaw of a rumor that eats at a life. I thought of small children who watched adult stories and learned how to speak of others. I thought of my son and daughter, who deserved a mother who did not bow to shadow. So I put the note in my pocket and slept a little. Dawn arrived, as it always does, with a light that hides nothing. I dressed, made tea, and walked out to the gate. The house looked very much like it had the week before, and yet nothing felt ordinary. I kept my hand over the paper in my pocket. It was my little measure of truth. I almost folded the note back into its envelope and decided to say nothing. But I did not. The private meeting came first. We sat in the small sitting room where their sunlight falls at that hour. The neighbor's wife was there, cheeks flushed from worry. I put my note on the table and slid it toward her like a small offering. "Thank you for coming," I said. My voice was plain. I did not want to fight. I wanted us to remember how to be neighbors. I said what I had written, the facts, the years of visits, that the visits were friendly and nothing more, that if a photograph had been explained in a way that hurt, I regretted the pain, and that kindness should not be reframed into something ugly. The pastor sat near me. June, my friend, sat close with her hands folded. Their presence made the room feel fair. The neighbor took off his hat and sighed. "Evie," he said, his voice small, "I never meant for this to hurt anyone. I should have been more careful." The wife listened. There were moments when she looked as if she might speak, and moments when she folded her hands and said nothing. I offered a practical step, that we make no assumptions in public, that visits occur only when invited, that, should a photograph or old story arise, we address it directly and quietly rather than letting it become rumor. I offered that if she wanted a public clarification, I would do it at the church with calm words. I offered to keep a list of agreed visits on my fridge so nothing would be misread. She looked at the note and then at me. For a long time there was no answer. I felt the room holding us. Finally, she said, in a small voice, "I was frightened." That was all. It was also everything. Fear does not excuse the harm done, but it does explain why a household might tighten its doors. We left with the agreement that, for the short term, visits would be more formal. We promised to call before coming, and to speak plainly if worry arose. We did not solve everything. We did not return to the old rhythm immediately, but we had a plan. When I finished the private meeting, and the neighbor's wife left the room, she looked away, and that silence said everything. The church hall smelled faintly of polish and lemon oil, that scent of old buildings that have held generations of whispers and prayers. Folding chairs scraped softly against the floor. The microphone crackled once, testing the quiet. I could feel the eyes of the lane on me. Neighbors, family, familiar faces pretending not to stare. I didn't want to perform, I wanted peace. But peace sometimes begins with the sound of your own voice in a room that isn't sure it wants to listen. The pastor opened the meeting gently, reminding everyone that our goal was understanding. His voice trembled a little. I appreciated that. He was not presiding over a spectacle, he was shepherding an awkward honesty. When my turn came, I didn't look at the microphone. I looked at the faces I'd known all my life, people I'd baked pies for, prayed with, borrowed sugar from. My hands didn't shake. I unfolded my note. I have lived on this street for 41 years. I began. I have welcomed neighbors for tea and for talk. If my kindness has ever looked confusing from the outside, let me say clearly now, there was never anything hidden to be ashamed of. Friendship, not secrecy, filled my Sundays. You could have heard a pin drop, I continued, quieter. A photograph was shared. A story was told. It hurt more than I can say, not because of scandal, but because trust was replaced with suspicion. I want my visits to be welcome for who I am, not explained away by someone else's fear. The neighbor's wife dabbed her eyes. She stood, hesitant. I was frightened, she said. I've been through something like this before. I shouldn't have assumed. Her husband reached for her hand. His voice was low. We both could have handled it better. Evelyn deserved a conversation, not a disappearance. Someone in the back, Mrs. Hale nodded audibly. We all should have asked before we talked, she murmured. A ripple of agreement moved through the room, like wind through curtains. I said only this: we all forget how easy it is to misread what's plain when we stop asking and start assuming. Let's agree to ask again. There was no grand applause, just the soft sigh of chairs adjusting as people breathed again. Someone brought a tissue box to the front table. The neighbor's wife crossed the space between us, that long few feet that can take a lifetime, and pressed my hand. I'm sorry, she whispered. The pastor wrote a note on the bulletin board afterward. Clarification shared. Kindness restored. Outside, the air smelled of early autumn. A small group gathered by the steps, speaking in that careful tone people use when they are trying to stitch something back together. The neighbor turned to me, eyes steady. Next Sunday, he said, if you'll have me, I'd like to bring tea. I smiled, weary but lighter. Bring your wife, I said. For a long moment, no one spoke. After the church hall meeting, life did not snap back to normal. It bent, then straightened slowly, like a branch that has survived a storm. We met again, this time at my kitchen table. No crowd, no pastor, just 3 cups of tea and a quiet agreement. We decided that visits would happen by invitation, not assumption. We promised to keep the porch light for welcome, but also to call ahead before knocking. The neighbor's wife offered a small olive branch of her own. Would you come to our house next time? She asked. So it doesn't always look like he's gone missing to yours. I said yes. It was a sensible kindness, a way to make sure friendship and propriety could coexist. My daughter set up a small whiteboard calendar by my fridge, just to keep it clear, she said with a smile. This way, no one has to guess. My son, once so anxious about appearances, sent a short text, proud of you, Mom. You handled it with grace. Trust didn't rebuild in speeches. It rebuilt in the sound of footsteps returning to familiar paths. The church bulletin carried a short note the following week. Thank you to Mrs. Hart for her kindness and integrity. People smiled again when they passed me on the lane. There were still absences, of course. Some neighbors who had gossiped never came to apologize, but that was all right. Sometimes dignity isn't about receiving apologies, it's about choosing not to shrink. We set rules around visiting so friendship wouldn't be a battlefield. And I found that structure didn't limit kindness, it protected it. The chair across from me filled again some Sundays. Other weeks it stayed empty, and that was fine, too. The emptiness no longer felt like judgment. It felt like space earned, space chosen. But mending a neighborhood takes time and the courage to keep trying. If I learned anything from that long season, it's this: dignity doesn't need to shout, it only needs to stay standing. We live in a time when people assume before they ask, and whisper before they listen. I want to remind anyone who hears my voice, you can stop a rumor by opening a door, not by slamming one. Here are the sentences I keep written on my fridge now. May I explain? Would you like to ask me directly? I'd rather we clear this up than let it grow. They sound simple, but they are armor made of grace. If someone misunderstands your kindness, don't surrender kindness, redefine it. If fear visits your door, open it with facts, not fury. If gossip finds your name, meet it with gentleness that leaves no room for doubt. I used to think keeping peace meant staying quiet. Now I know peace sometimes begins with a calm, public truth. And remember, civility isn't weakness, it's work. It's the American way at its best. We argue, we listen, we mend. Dignity is a quiet conversation. Ask, explain, and then decide. We weren't perfect, but we were learning how to be neighbors again. Weeks after the story settled, I started receiving letters, some in the mailbox, some through the church. One came from a woman in the next county. Your story made me call my sister after 3 years of silence. Another said, we had a similar misunderstanding. I used your words, may I explain? And it changed everything. Even the pastor smiled. One Sunday, ends it. You've given this town a new kind of etiquette. The most touching came folded in a child's handwriting. Thank you for making my grandma friends with her neighbor again. People told me they found courage to speak, rather than to gossip. And that was worth every awkward moment, every breath it took to steady my voice. A message arrived that made me cry. You taught me how to ask, not accuse. Now the kettle sings as it always did. The sugar bowl gleams. The radio hums. The same tune. But something in the air has settled. We still keep the kettle on now with invitations that are spoken and agreed. He calls before coming. She sometimes joins him. And when they leave, they take leftovers and leave laughter. The lane feels neighborly again. Not because we forgot the hurt, but because we faced it. My house has the same number, the same garden, the same humming porch light, but it no longer hosts unspoken tension. Sometimes the chair beside me is empty, sometimes it's full. Either way, the tea stays warm. The next Sunday, the doorbell rang and someone stayed for tea. If this story touched you, tell me, how would you protect your porch and your peace? Leave a comment below. Share this with someone who needs calm, courage, and subscribe for more true stories from the heart. Next time, a trunk, a letter, and a secret that rewrites a summer. Thank you for listening, and for believing that grace can still change a neighborhood. See you soon.